Well, hello everyone. Welcome to the Var Valley podcast. The word Var is short for the French word varier, which means a person who varies. This channel is a spin-off of the History Valley podcast, which is where I spend much of my time interviewing mainstream scholars. Over here, however, I and the co-host of this channel, DJ Shonsky, interview a variety of alternative scholars who have radically different views from the mainstream. That being said, I'll provide the following disclaimer. I am not convinced by any of the people that are being interviewed here on Var Valley, and my views may not align with the views of DJ Shonsky. I am simply curious to figure out why they believe the things that they believe, and it does not represent my views in any way, shape, or form. Thank you.
Well, hello. Welcome to the Var Valley podcast. I'm your host, DJ Shonsky. I'm here today with Emmet Sweeney, and today we're going to have a doozy of a show. This show is entitled "The Islamic Golden Age Never Happened." That's pretty radical, Emmet.
Yeah, it is,
Man,
Sean, and I like to say radical things.
yeah. I say go ahead and take it away, Emmet. We do have some slides prepared when we get to that point. But the Islamic
Yeah,
Golden Age never happened, and there's going to be a lot of scholars that would disagree. But again, we are using the written sources, and we are corroborating the written sources with stratigraphy to validate if these written sources are accurate, truthful, and happen in the period of time that they say they happened in. So, Emmett, without further ado, take it away.
thank you very much, Sean. Yeah, a huge amount has been written about the supposed Islamic Golden Age, which allegedly stretched from the mid 7th century until the end of the 10th century. Now, by coincidence, these 3 centuries or 3.5 centuries, well, 3 centuries basically, coincide with the very depths of what is called the Dark Age in Europe, especially in Western Europe. Not so much allegedly in Byzantium and the Eastern Roman Empire, but certainly in Western Europe, Central and Western Europe. And the narrative is that between the mid 7th century, when the Caliphate was established, and the end of the 10th or into the early 11th century, Islam experienced an age of unprecedented wealth, prosperity, knowledge, progress in science, etc. And in the meantime, during those 3 centuries, Europe was essentially a barbarian society. The Western Roman Empire having fallen in 476 AD, and well, that was the formal abolition of the Western Empire. And the provinces of that empire then been run by semi-barbarian or semi-barbarian kings, Franks, Goths, Vandals, etc. And the common image of that time in Europe is people living in mud huts, mosquito-infested, thatched mud huts, whilst the people of the caliphate of the Islamic world were living in sort of a marble palaces, more or less. I'll give you an example. One historian wrote in the 1950s, one English historian, describing Cordoba in the 8th and 9th century, Cordoba in Spain, which was part of the emirate of Al-Andalus and then the Caliphate of Spain or Andalusia. So Cordoba at that time was supposed to have had a population of upwards of 500,000 people, with literally a couple of hundred bathing houses, hundreds of mosques, schools of learning, etc. So it was pictured a vast metropolis, prosperous, luxurious, with a technology way above anything in Europe, certainly in Christian Europe. And that is more or less the myth of the Islamic Golden Age. Baghdad in the 8th century having allegedly been founded shortly before the time of Harun, of the semi-mythical, semi-legendary Harun al-Rashid of the Arabian Nights fame. Had allegedly 1 million people. Again, a house of learning, a vast metropolis with opulence, wealth, learning, prosperity. And similarly, other cities in the Islamic and the Caliphate, Alexandria, etc. So what we have is this image of a vastly wealthy, vastly prosperous, and vastly learned Islamic world contrasted with an impoverished, backward, superstitious, and essentially barbarous Europe, especially during those centuries, the 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. Now, the problem is that absolutely none of this can be confirmed by archaeology or has been confirmed. And again, quite the opposite. Archaeology has in fact refuted the narrative entirely. I'll give you one example. During the 1930s, a French archaeologist called Dunand excavated the ancient port city of Byblos in what is now Lebanon, ancient Phoenicia. In Byblos, he found the remains of the early Phoenicians, Egyptian influence, Assyrian, Babylonian, Hellenistic, Greek and Roman periods, early Roman periods, later Roman periods, right until the end of the 6th century, early 7th century. And then absolutely nothing, no traces whatsoever of the Umayyad or the Abbasid Caliphate. The next remains, the next evidence of settlement in Byblos comes with a Crusader fortress built at the end of the 11th century. And they built on Byzantine remains or Byzantine foundations of the 7th century. So there was no evidence of any Umayyad or Abbasid presence at all during these almost 4 centuries. In Spain, again, when archaeology really got going in the Iberian Peninsula in the early 20th century, it was expected that a vastly opulent Islamic emirate of Al-Andalus would be discovered, dating from the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries, with a possible partial decline then from the 11th or 12th century. And again, they found nothing of the sort. A recent publication on the archaeology of Spain, an archaeological guide to Spain, the Oxford Archaeological Guide, as far as I'm aware, I've got it upstairs, could show absolutely nothing. I mean, almost nothing for the 3 centuries of the alleged Golden Age, of the 8th, 9th, and up until the mid-10th or even late 10th century, there was virtually nothing. In the whole of Spain, it listed 11 bits of pottery or partial walls, which could have been or may have been from the early Islamic centuries. So there was a questionable bits of pottery, which could equally have dated from the 11th century, questionable a wall or two, no more than 11 single items in the whole of Spain. Now, compare that with the Visigoth period. The Visigoths ruled Spain after the fall of the Western Empire, the Western Roman Empire, for actually somewhat less time than that, about 2 centuries, roughly between the mid-5th and the mid-7th, early 8th century. Yeah, but 2.5 centuries. And yet the same archaeological guide lists literally hundreds, if not thousands, of Visigoth finds, settlements, artifacts. Okay. So in the same period, roughly, of the same length of period for Visigoth and early Islamic Caliphate, Golden Age Emirate, there was 11 finds for the Islamic period and many hundreds. I didn't actually count, but it could even have gone into the thousands, I think, of Visigoth artifacts, remains, settlements, etc. So where does that leave this alleged Islamic Golden Age? Now, I have to diverge somewhat. Let's go back to the Islamic heartland. Here we're talking about basically Iraq and Syria, the ancient Fertile Crescent, I suppose. Baghdad, obviously, the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, supposedly from the mid-8th century, early 8th century. Again, allegedly the most prosperous and the most enlightened period of the Islamic Golden Age. Now, Baghdad, there are many interesting things about Baghdad. It was built in a circular design, a huge, I think you may have an image of it there. What
I do. Give me a second here.
Yeah, how it was certainly described in the literature. Though I emphasize very little of this Baghdad has actually been found. Now, the interesting thing about the design of Baghdad at this particular time is that circular design is classic Sasanian Persian. The first Sassanid or Sasanian Persian emperor, Ardashir I, constructed a huge city in Iran in a circular design pattern, precisely like Baghdad several centuries later. Now, what we find where we do find early Islamic remains, they're precious few, but the few that we do find from the 7th century can easily, almost always be interpreted as Sasanian Persian. That goes for Baghdad. Very, very little has been discovered from Baghdad in its supposed glorious period, and I'll explain that in a minute. Now, there is one city which has supposedly left archaeological evidence of this Islamic Golden Age, and that is Samarra, also in Iraq, and not too far from Baghdad. Now, again, Samarra was excavated by a German team under Herzfeld in the early 20th century. And sure enough, an extensive and very large city was excavated. But again, and while Herzfeld, relying on the written sources, initially tried to identify basically everything he found as part of the constructions of the Abbasid caliphs, what he found was that most of the actual city, which as it stands, seems to have been constructed by the last of the Persian Sasanian kings or Sassanid kings, Khusrau I and Khusrau II. And in fact, it was Khusrau I who built this great canal leading up to the site of the city, which enabled the city to flourish, given a ready water supply, etc. And most of what he actually discovered seems to have been late Sasanian or Sassanid Persian, rather than Islamic Caliphate material. Now, there are, should I say, a lot of material remains which can definitely be dated to the Islamic period. There are coins, there are bits of pottery with Arabic inscriptions. And again, Hertzfeld was very keen to date these inevitably to the alleged heart, the core of the Islamic Golden Age, to the 8th, 9th, and 10th century. It turned out that all of these can equally well be dated, in fact, better dated, to the late 10th and the 11th century. So what we have in Samarra is a Sasanian or Sassanid Persian city of the late 6th, early 7th century. And then immediately after that, an Abbasid Arab caliphal city, almost certainly of the late 10th and the 11th century. And again, with precious little that can actually, with certainty, be assigned to the intervening centuries, the 8th, 9th, and early 10th centuries. Now, why is this? Why is this absence? Why is there almost as great an absence of archaeology in the Islamic world during the mid 7th, 8th, 9th, until the late 10th centuries? Why does that occur both in Europe? Now, remember, Europe got this reputation of being dark, partly because it couldn't show much or anything of architecture or culture precisely in those centuries. And these were the centuries of the Viking raids, of the Hungarian, the Magyar invasions, etc., and semi-barbarian, Germanic kings ruling the Frankish and the Visigothic kingdoms. So Europe got this reputation for being in a dark age largely because it couldn't produce much archaeology or visible remains during these centuries. It now seems that the Islamic world cannot produce much either. Now, this is the big question. Why is the Islamic world just as dark in these centuries as the European world? Now, it's not just the Islamic world that can't produce a golden age during this time. It was formerly believed until the age of archaeology that whilst Western Europe, or the Western Roman Empire, collapsed into ignorant barbarism during those centuries, at least Byzantium, at least Constantinople, kept alive the flame of civilization, of learning, of the arts and sciences, etc. And I could quote historians writing in the 1930s, 1920s, using just literary sources, claiming that Byzantium continued to be a vast metropolis, prosperous, learned, during the times that, during the darkest period of ignorance and savagery in Western Europe. And then along came archaeology. Now, Cyril Mango, in the latter half of the 20th century, was one of the most important authorities on Byzantium during these centuries, and especially Byzantine archaeology. And he was forced to admit that Byzantium too experienced a dark age in the years following 615, 620. Everything disappears. Architecture, art, pottery, coins, all kinds of coinage, nothing. Now we have a huge list of alleged Byzantine emperors for these 3 centuries. And now and again they find a coin which, might have a kind of a classic like Constantius or some other common name, which was borne by several Byzantine emperors. And there's this desperate attempt to date 1 or 2 of these coins to one of these alleged Dark Age emperors. But again, this all strikes at desperation. There's nothing that can be attributed. Cyril Mango was forced to admit that virtually all coinage disappears during these 3 centuries. He said, for example, that for the 6th century, he says there's vast amounts of numismatic evidence of coinage, of gold, of silver coinage, and of copper coinage. For the early part of the 7th century, there's a lot, but by the mid-century, coinage virtually disappears or becomes very scarce. By the 8th century, it's almost non-existent. Whereas they had found literally hundreds and sometimes thousands of coins for the 6th century. By the 8th century, it was down to about 5 or 6. By the 9th century, it was the same 5, 6, 7 coins that could be dated possibly to that time. Early 10th century, it was the same. Only with the late 10th century is there the appearance again of any form of abundant coins or coinage. And what's very striking, of course, is that the coins of the late 10th century look exactly like the coins of the early 7th century. There's virtually no change, no development in design in those 3 intervening centuries. And it's the same with basilicas, with churches. Church building was quite frequent up until the late 6th century, early 7th. Then it completely stops and resumes in the late 10th century, early 11th century. And once again, the churches of the late 10th, early 11th century are basically identical in design to the churches of the 6th and 7th centuries. So what's happening here? What is happening? Why is there no archaeology anywhere during these 3 centuries? Well, there are a number of possible answers, and in some cases, divergent explanations. As you know, Gunnar Heinsohn believed that there was some form of catastrophic disturbance, and there's also combined with a calendrical with an error or a fabrication of the timescale. Whereas Herbert Illig was more inclined to believe it's just a fabricated chronology, which is to blame. That the missing centuries in terms of archaeology are missing simply because they didn't exist. So there are two opinions on this, which I think Gunnar Heinsohn has a bit of both. He agrees that the centuries didn't exist, but he also believes that there was a period of a decline caused by some form of natural disaster. Maybe you would like to discuss a little bit about that yourself, Sean.
Yeah. There's a catastrophes or crisis written of in the 230s, the
Mhm.
530s, and the 930s. Though catastrophically, you do have Vesuvius eruption, I think 79, and you do have a catastrophe in like the 260s in Rome, where they're saying the sea levels rose and there's flooding, essentially. So what his approach is, what he's essentially doing is in saying is that the three catastrophes and crisis are all one: the 230s, the 530s, and the 930s. And that the first through third century Rome and fourth through sixth century Constantinople are contemporary with each other. Maybe not a one-to-one overlay, but they're much more contemporary with each other. It is said that the Roman cities were built basically between the first and third centuries, while there's nothing going on in Constantinople. And then Rome stops building after the third century. Then centuries 4 through 6, Constantinople's being built up, which is odd. There could be some overlap.
Yeah.
It seems that way, but then Illig's approach is much different and it has more to do with calendars. And actually, falsification of documentation. I think, again, both should be looked at, and we've agreed that it's this stuff here makes you think, really does. It is also admitted, last point, in Laurent Gagnon, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, he did a book on the first millennium AD chronology controversy, and it is his opinion that it's still a work in progress, essentially. Heinsohn may have written more than Illig and may have a bigger following. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't. I'm not sure about that. But, it's something that's still like a work in progress, if you will. It's not set in stone, but between both of the guys, they're on to something. And most academics don't even look at this stuff. They just go with what they were taught, essentially, with the dates, with the history, and
But
they
I
don't.
think,
They're ignoring the archaeological finds. Go ahead.
part of the problem is over specialization. Most academics are so specialized nowadays. They know one little area. Now the problem is that most of the actual historians are almost completely unaware of the archaeology. The archaeological evidence hasn't caught up with them yet. They don't seem to be aware of it. They just keep, if you mention this to them, they just keep harping back to the written sources, as if that's, they don't understand the significance of what archaeology has found or not found in this case. But even the written sources, they should have been aware that there's something wrong. For example, there's a duplication and triplication happens in the Islamic written sources just as much as in the European written sources. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. India was supposedly the first Islamic invader of India is named Muhammad bin Qasim around 720. And he invaded northern India, what is now Pakistan, and the northern plain of India, and did immense damage against the infidels, as they were called. But it was a sweeping raid more than anything. There was a huge amount of booty taken, slaves taken, a huge amount of destruction. And then nothing for 3 centuries. So that was Muhammad bin Qasim. Then 720, then in 1020, almost exactly 300 years later, Mahmud of Ghazni. Now note the names, Muhammad bin Qasim and Muhammad of Ghazni comes almost exactly 3 centuries later and does exactly the same as Muhammad bin Qasim in the early 8th century, 300 years earlier. He invades the north of India. He destroys Buddhist and Hindu temples and burns their gods and plunders the country and takes vast amounts of slaves, etc. But doesn't actually set up a permanent Islamic State, just like his predecessor 300 years earlier. And quite apart from the obvious similarities in the names, Mahmud of Ghazni and Muhammad bin Qasim, the fact that they invade the same area of India and do almost the same things should have kind of warned people that, what is happening here? Is this some kind of a duplication of history? Now, ironically enough, we find the same thing in Europe at the time. I'll give you an example from my home country, the country I was born in, Scotland. Macbeth, famously, the King of Scotland around 1050, his final, according to Shakespeare anyway, his final stand was at a castle called Dunsinane, or Dunsinane, as it's called in Scotland. Famously, the witches told him that when Birnam Wood walks, which is just kind of outside Dunsinane or Dunsinane, Macbeth would meet his end. Anyway, archaeologists, or the site of Dunsinane has never been lost, and archaeologists expected to find a medieval castle from the 11th century, roughly 1050. So they started to dig in the top of the hill, the top of Dunsinane Hill. And what did they find? They found no such thing. What they found was a late Iron Age fort of the late 7th, early 8th century. Okay, so a circular Iron Age fort structure dating from around, they reckon, 750 AD. So almost precisely 300 years before 1050, the time of Macbeth. And the same process is revealed everywhere. There's this weird gap, completely unexpected, And again, the archaeologist says, what they found was puzzling and surprising, etc. You hear this all the time. In Europe's interaction with the Islamic world, we have the Viking expansion, which was to some degree elicited by the Islamic demand from the 7th century for European slaves. Now, the Vikings met that demand, especially in the East, by capturing Slavic peasants, as I mentioned in the last episode. So they would sail down the Dnieper and the Volga rivers into the Caspian and the Black Seas and raiding Slavic villages as they went, capturing slaves, both male and female, and selling them into the Caliphate mainly. Now, allegedly, some were sold into Byzantium. I'm not 100% sure how true that was, but I know it was the Islamic world that was the main recipient of these Slavic slaves. So Islamic coinage, gold coins, begin to appear. Aurum infelix, as it's called, unhappy gold, because it was the price of human misery. So these Islamic coins begin to appear in Scandinavia and Viking settlements in northern Russia, including a great Swedish Viking settlement called Staraya Ladoga on the shores of Lake Ladoga near St. Petersburg. And sure enough, this settlement has been dated fairly reliably to the late 7th, early 8th century, which is about 200 years before the Vikings are supposed to have begun their expeditions. And in this settlement, they found early Islamic Persian, Sasanian Persian looking coins from the early 7th century. And the problem is that these Persian-style 7th century, supposedly early Islamic coins, now begin to appear all over Scandinavia in hordes, very often alongside coins which supposedly date from 300 years later, Islamic coins which, date allegedly from the mid-10th, late 10th, early 11th centuries. So you have coins sitting right next to each other, which are separated in time by 300 years. Now, that shouldn't be, it could be that some Islamic people kept 300-year-old heirlooms and then used them to buy slaves, but that's highly unlikely. The more rational and logical explanation is that the Islamic coins of the 10th century, or the late 10th and the early 11th century, come immediately after the proto-Islamic Persian coins of the early 7th century, and there's no 300-year gap between them. One comes immediately after the other, and both were in circulation simultaneously. And I would remind anybody watching, any of the viewers or listeners, that the first Islamic coins, allegedly Islamic coins, look exactly Persian. They have the head of the Persian king, either Khusro II or Yezdegerd III, who was allegedly the last Sasanian Zoroastrian emperor. Now, in the reverse side of the coin, they have a Zoroastrian fire temple. But the only thing that distinguishes or identifies these coins as Islamic is the inscription Bism Allah, in the name of God, which is Arabic or Aramaic, almost certainly Arabic in this case. Now, the problem is, why would, if this was a genuinely Islamic coin, why would they have the head of a king? Islam forbids the portrayal of any human being. Imagery, it forbids imagery very strictly. And it would certainly not allow the image of a Zoroastrian fire temple, which would be regarded as positive blasphemy. So it's quite clear that, and furthermore, why imprint the name of a Persian king on an Islamic coin? Why not the name of Muhammad? Why not the name of one of the early caliphs, the Rashidun caliphs, Uthman or Umar or Abu Bakr? The names that none of these people appear in any contemporary monuments. There's no archaeological evidence of their existence whatsoever. And as I said before, the overwhelming evidence is that the entire narrative of Islam's origin and early expansion is complete fiction. In fact, the Zoroastrian Persian kings converted to some form of Christianity, where the name Mahmud, the praised one, was actually a title of Jesus. Now, some have suggested a form of Nestorianism, one of the offshoots of Christianity. Others have suggested possibly a version of Nazarite or Ebionitism, which was the Judaizing version of Christianity practiced for a long time in Jerusalem, which mandated circumcision and the following of the Mosaic Code regarding things like acceptable foods and unacceptable, clean and unclean food, etc. And these people, these were the group that completely rejected St. Paul, for example, and regarded Paul as a complete heretic and not a true follower of Yeshua, who was essentially still a practicing Jew. That was their belief, the Ebionites. Now, it seems that early Islam or proto-Islam may have been a kind of a combination of Nestorian and Ebionitism. Some unorthodox version of Christianity, certainly not recognized either in Byzantium, Rome, or Alexandria, but a form of Christianity to which these last of the Persian emperors converted, and therefore this proto-Islam as became the official religion of the late Persian Empire. First of all, alongside Zoroastrianism, and then completely replacing Zoroastrianism. So that's a kind of a divergence into a slightly different topic. As I say, the main point here that I seek to establish is that the prosperous, enlightened Islamic Golden Age is mythical. What happened is that it would appear that the early Islam, which essentially came about, I would suggest, by a coup d'etat staged by Arab generals against the Persian kings and a takeover by an Arab elite of the Persian Empire. This empire was initially not Islamic in the sense that we understand, because Islam didn't exist. It was a branch of Christianity. They followed a branch of Christianity, a very unorthodox branch of Christianity, a Judaizing branch of Christianity, we might say. And they inherited an empire which already controlled the great centers of civilization. The Persians had already conquered Egypt, Alexandria, much of all of Mesopotamia, Syria, Antioch, some of the great cities of what is now Turkey. There was Anatolia. So it controlled the wealthiest and the most prosperous and the most learned parts of the ancient world. This was what proto-Islam inherited. And that's where the myth of the Golden Age, but that head start that Islam, the Islamic world had, was quickly frittered away and crushed by the dead weight of an oppressive theocracy, which took place, which enveloped the world, that part of the world, when a very doctrinaire form of what we now call Islam took shape. Not indeed after many centuries, but after a few decades. And the actual, the spirit of inquiry, which flourished under the Sasanian Persians and the Byzantines, was quickly crushed. And the Arab world, which had initially a vast head start in terms of prosperity, wealth, learning, quickly fell behind Europe. So that by the time of the First Crusade of 1090s, Europe had essentially caught up. Barbarous backward Europe had caught up and began to overtake the Islamic world in terms of learning and technology. Mm-hmm. So we have now, we have been fed a kind of a modern, politically correct, if you could call it, myth about the relationship between the Islamic world and the Christian world, which is actually in some ways the inverse of the truth. The narrative which has been promoted over the past certainly 40 or 50 years is almost the exact opposite of what actually happened. So under the influence of Al-Ghazali, this Islamic scholar of what we call the early 11th century, all scientific inquiry was quickly crushed, and it was deemed to be almost blasphemous to inquire into the workings of the universe, because this was an attempt to kind of look into the mysteries of God or of Allah, which human beings shouldn't be doing and had no business doing. And basically the philosophy they took root is that which was attributed to the Caliph Umar when he was alleged to have burned the Library of Alexandria. Certainly no Caliph Umar existed, but certainly there may have been a general Umar, of an Arab general working for the Persians at the time. Whether he actually destroyed the Library of Alexandria, I don't know. But his remark was supposed to have been, some of the soldiers came to him and said, what should we do about this great library, this huge collection of books? He says, if the books don't contradict the Quran, then we don't need them. If they say the same thing as the Quran, we don't need them. All we need is the Quran. And if they contradict the Quran, they should be burned anyway. He says, so just burn them all. Now, that may be an apocryphal tale, I don't know. But there's no question that shortly after the Islamic takeover of Egypt, Egypt's history was entirely forgotten. Entirely. And so you have Islamic writers of the 11th century wondering about the pyramids, who built them. Was it the pharaoh? Were they storerooms built by the pharaoh at the orders of Joseph, the biblical patriarch, to store grain during the famine of 7 years? Whereas in the libraries of Alexandria and the other libraries of Egypt, there were the books of Herodotus and Diodorus of Sicily, which not only gave the names of the pharaohs who built the pyramids, but explained how they were built. And as I say, that was quickly lost. All that knowledge was quickly lost after the Islamic takeover of Egypt. So the idea of an Islamic Golden Age is based on faulty, I would argue anyway, certainly Herbert Illigan and many others, and I think possibly also Gunnar would have argued, that is built on a faulty understanding of chronology and the historical processes as they really happened.
Right. A quick piggyback comment. Emmet mentioned the coins. We just did the video a couple weeks ago about the coins. Let's call Palestine the West. So the Arab coins found, we just watched a video about this, a little short video. The coins then, to make it easier for the listener and the viewer, the coins in Palestine, and we'll call that the West, have the Christian crosses on them. And then the coins that we'll call in the East, which would be Iraq, Northeast, all those coins have the Zoroastrian symbolism on those coins. Okay, that it's pretty basic. And then in Mecca, Medina, guess what? No coins. They're not even minted there. So that becomes fabricated essentially. That Mecca and Medina are is a great center of the Islamic world, but there really is nothing there. Essentially, that kind of makes it simple if you can picture it that way. And I've been getting a lot of video feeds now because of the algorithm, and because we did the video, and I'm seeing this stuff, and it's like, wow, okay, that makes it pretty clear cut and simple. Before we go any further now, Emmet, I want you to kind of go back to, let's see, we have the slides of the round city of Baghdad. Okay, was that round city ever found?
Basically, almost nothing. There are two excuses for this. First of all, that the Mongols completely sacked Baghdad in, I think it was 1280 or something, and they razed it to the ground. And the other explanation is that Baghdad is a modern metropolis, and it hasn't been possible to do much archaeology. So basically, almost nothing of this alleged vast metropolis has been found. I don't know if any artifacts at all. I presume some things have been found, but nothing like what we'd expect. By way of comparison, London or Londinium during the Roman period was never more than a town of about 40 or 50,000 people, and yet it has shown literally hundreds of first-class Roman remains,
Right. Yes.
deep underneath modern London. Whereas Baghdad was supposed to have been a metropolis of 1 million people under Harun al-Rashid, and we found virtually nothing. We found virtually nothing. So,
Can we look at some of the slides from Cordoba and Samara? Then you've been talking about that.
yeah. Now this is the
Is
Great
there-
Mosque. This is the Great Mosque of Cordoba. Now, I was there last June, and it is an impressive structure. Now, this was supposed to have, it was initially a Christian cathedral, St. Vincent's Cathedral, built either by the late Romans or the Visigoths. I'm not 100% sure, but it was a Christian cathedral until the Arab conquest or the Berber conquest. And Abd al-Rahman or Rahman I, it says, began converting it into a mosque. That was about 750. 100 years later, his namesake Abd al-Rahman II did further work on it, allegedly. This according to the written sources. And 100 years after that, Abd al-Rahman III in the late 10th century completed the work. Now, of those three Abd al-Rahmans, the only one that has left any visible trace of his work is the third one, Abd al-Rahman III, the one that allegedly completed the transformation of the cathedral into a mosque. Okay, so it's all his archaeology there. And again, there's a question here of duplication and triplication of characters. How is it that no archaeology can be found associated with Abd al-Rahman I, Abd al-Rahman II? Only Abd al-Rahman III shows any archaeological evidence of his existence. And that would naturally lead to the conclusion that there was only one Abd al-Rahman, and he was both the first and the third. He was the one and only. And he was the one that actually converted this monument into a mosque in the late 10th century, or whatever that really is in terms of real time, late 7th century. I don't know. He was supposedly the one that invaded France, crossed the Pyrenees with a huge army, and was stopped by the Frankish king, Charles the Hammer, Charles Martel, at Tours, I think, in 790 or something like that. So he would have been, that would have been the first Abd al-Rahman, who was, as we say, identical to both the second and the third, the first and only Abd al-Rahman. So we've got this phenomenon in the Islamic world, just as in the Christian world, of duplication and triplication of historical characters and even names. Now we find that among the Franks. The Merovingian kings have names like Clovis, right? Whereas the Carolingian kings who come after them, also Frankish, have names like Lovis, which is now became Louis. So Clovis is spelt then with the C missing, so it's Lovis, okay? And so you have this phenomenon among the Merovingians. So Clothar becomes Lothar among the Carolingians. So the names, with slight variations in spellings between the Merovingians and the Carolingians, shows again a duplication and a triplication of the same characters over many centuries. And one of the things that Herbert Illig mentions is that the earliest Viking settlements of Iceland. Now, remember, Iceland was supposedly colonized by the Norwegian Vikings, I think, in the late 10th century. So something like 960s, okay? But what they found was that the earliest Viking houses in Iceland were of Merovingian design. Now, the Merovingians, the Merovingian dynasty disappeared 300 years earlier. So again, we've got this problem of this time leap, right? So we have the Norse men of the late 10th century imitating Merovingian building styles and techniques of the late 7th century or mid 7th century. So again, this huge gap, which has so far has never been explained or even properly discussed. This is part of the problem.
Century 6 to 10 has always been where the controversy starts.
Yeah, the darkest of this.
You have the written sources that claim this happened and that happened, but then there's no archaeological evidence. There's no written evidence at the time. And then we have these enigmas. Here's another enigma. This is Samara. And this is in the same period of time as Cordoba, in the same period of time as the circular city in Baghdad. And we have the same, which I would imagine this is during the Zoroastrian period, I would say, just at first glance. What's your take on Samara and this?
Well, this is allegedly a minaret of a mosque, but it's not built like any other minaret. It's clearly it clearly owns much more to a kind of a Mesopotamian ziggurat type of structure. And it's alleged to have been constructed by one of the Abbasid caliphs of the 9th or 10th century. But again, there's very little evidence for this. This was a problem highlighted by Herbert Illig regarding alleged Carolingian remains in France and Germany. There's the great Basilica Chapel at Aachen in Germany, which has a dome and is very, very similar in design to the San Vitale church in Ravenna, which dates from the time of the Emperor Justinian. Now, the Aachen church is supposed to date from the time of Charlemagne, who, by the way, was supposedly a contemporary of the semi-legendary mythical Harun al-Rashid. And it's not a coincidence that Harun al-Rashid's name is linked to the Arabian Nights and the Sinbad story and all this kind of stuff, because I would argue that he's basically almost as mythical as the elements of those stories, as is Charlemagne. But the chapel at Aachen can in no way be dated to the 8th century. Every single feature of the design, of the architecture, of the techniques involved dates it to the mid to late 11th century. And Herbert Illig went over all those points in detail in several of his books. So again, this alleged minaret is supposedly dated, according to tradition, by one of these Abbasid caliphs, but there's no actual real evidence, no hard evidence for that in the ground.
Would there be any inscriptions, anything of that nature? Inscriptions of any of these caliphs?
No, there's basically nothing. It's tradition has said it, and tradition says many things, tradition attributes the Aachen Chapel to Charlemagne, but there's no evidence that either that he ever existed or that it was built in his time, you know. And it's the same with this. So we have this long list of Abbasid caliphs, just like we have this long list of Byzantine emperors for this period, but with virtually no material evidence of any of their existence, you know, either in terms of inscriptions or coins or anything like that. You know, these are semi-mythical, semi-legendary characters. The real historical people begin to appear in the late 10th and the early 11th centuries, just as they do in Europe. So it's everything before roughly 1000 or 500, 960 or 970. Everything before that is just basically stories and, you know, written material and chronicles which allegedly give accounts of real events, but which have no archaeological proof of their existence, you know, in the ground whatsoever, in any shape or form. And so, until historians begin trying to integrate their written sources with what has actually been found, and to look at those written sources with a far more critical eye, you know, as my father used to say, pen and paper refuse nothing. You know, you can write whatever you want, you know, but that's you know, that means nothing unless it can be confirmed by what you find in the ground, and that should come first. And that was the great strength of Gunnar Heinsohn. You know, he insisted, look, if it can't be confirmed by archaeology, then how can we accept it existed? Like, how can we be sure that there's any reality behind this?
Right.
And it's basic common sense when you think about it. And yet, unfortunately, common sense isn't that common.
Right. Yeah. And you know, Gunnar relied a lot on Richard Krautenheimer's analysis, and he was an art and architectural expert, and he's the one that pointed out churches throughout the first millennium, they're all based on older basilica design. He even went over went through the San Clemente stratigraphy and really looked at it with a fine-tooth comb, and his results differ from what, you know, a consensus would be even on that structure. So, you know, Gunnar Heinsohn, in other words, he didn't just come up with this out of thin air. He looked at the experts. He looked at other sources. I don't have as much on Illig, and, you know, I'm just kind of piggybacking off of what I'm getting from Emmet and what little I can get, though I just started using a German translator, because we're going to pretty much end kind of here. So, you know, Jan Buford, he is also Dutch. He speaks German. He worked alongside of Heinsohn. I've made contact with him, and in his group, everybody reads and speaks German. So I'm now just learning, it's pretty easy though, how to translate papers and his appendices from German to English. So then that way I can now look even more so at Illig's work, and I'm a little familiar with it and what his premise is. And there's, again, a lot of rejection in the mainstream place when it comes to people like Illig and even Heinsohn. Heinsohn maybe not as much, but nonetheless, that's ego. I'm going to say it that way. That's ego, and especially coming from PhDs. I have a opposition to when information is presented and it does have, you know, a substantial amount of physical evidence to back it. PhDs get in their feelings really fast. And well, because they never challenged any of these ideas. They took it. I call it biting on the rubber worm. I'm going to call it what it is. When you go fishing and use rubber worms, wouldn't a fish be pretty upset if his last meal wasn't even real? It's pretty simple. And at university levels, we don't get to question, really. I went to university. Emmet went to university. You don't get to question the origins of the ideas. No. Not really. You can critique them, but you don't really get to question where this stuff actually came from. It's just, this is what it is. We're going to keep moving forward, and that's pretty much it. But nonetheless, I can't have Jan on the show because he doesn't speak English. I'll try to figure something out in terms of maybe how to present some of what he's writing and what he's written. Emmett, with that, would you like to give your final closing thoughts on the Islamic Golden Age never happened? And we've talked, I know I like to monologue here, but we talked about the castle in Granada in Alhambra, which is an Islamic work, supposedly between 1250-ish and 1350. So the 13th and 14th centuries. That's a marvelous feat where, scientism is implemented in the design of the structure.
Mm-hmm.
There's water clocks. Would that be the Islamic Golden Age then, which comes much later than what the written sources say?
Yeah, that was a kind of, I suppose, Islamic Golden Age, certainly in that part of the world. But that is not what is normally meant, by the term. So yeah, I suppose there was a kind of certainly a late flowering of, to some degree, a prosperous and fairly, for some people, opulent Islam in those parts of Spain. But in general, the Islamic world fell behind Europe from the 12th, certainly late 11th, early 12th centuries. They started to fall behind very, very rapidly. Whereas Europe eagerly adopted new sciences and techniques and technologies, innovations in the use of firearms, etc., which initially came from China. The Arabic numeral system wasn't Arabic at all. It was invented by an Indian, a Hindu mathematician. But certainly it became known as Arabic in Europe. And certainly the early caliphate, I would call it the late Sasanian caliphate of proto-Islam, still certainly did, for a while, for a few decades anyway, apparently hold on to some respect for learning, for science, for literature, for the arts, even for music and poetry. But that was quickly crushed, unfortunately. So certainly European scholars did, in the 10th, 11th centuries, get access to certain scientific ideas, very often emanating from the Greeks and the Romans, translated into modern European languages via Arabic sometimes. There's no question about that. And there were a few, certainly one or two Arabic scholars and mathematicians who, in the early caliphate, as I say, the proto-caliphate, the proto-Islamic, it wasn't proper Islam at the time. I would call it proto-Islam. And as I say, there's no evidence. There's no real archaeological evidence for what we call Islam until about the late 10th century, even the early 11th century. There's no real archaeological evidence that any such thing existed before that time. But certainly in the 7th century, there was I would call it a late Sassanid Persian proto-Islam. There certainly was. And it was a proto-Islam. It was a culture which did still respect the arts and the sciences, and which even for a while possibly promoted them. And many of the ideas of China, the technologies and the learning of China and India, did ultimately reach Europe, Western Europe, very often through the filter of the proto-Islamic world and the Byzantine world at that stage. But whereas the Europeans rapidly grasped these things with both hands, silk making, printing, mathematics, Arabic numerals, the decimary system, the zero, um, new forms, new mathematical ideas, new astronomical ideas. These things were grasped eagerly by the Europeans. They were rapidly crushed under the weight of an Islamic theocracy by Al-Ghazali in the early 11th century. Not just by him, obviously, he had to have support of the ruling authorities at the time. And he condemned all this scientific inquiry and as un-Islamic, etc. And it was that spirit of inquiry was crushed at that stage. And that's when we have the appearance finally then of what we would call Islam, what we now call Islam. But until that time, as I said, there was only what we call a proto-Islam, which arguably didn't worship any Muhammad, any prophet called Muhammad, and really Mahmud M.H.M.Ed was actually a title of Jesus, the praised one, because as I say on the coins of that period, he is holding a cross,
Right.
So, and he's depicted as a person, again, completely un-Islamic.
Right. Now I'm going to kind of end the show with a comment from a viewer, Draconis Scinticus. Well, the don't adds up thing in case of Arabs is how the heck they jump in history in 7th century. And after 300 years, they also have scientists, mathematicians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this is the purpose of doing the show, because things don't add up. And according to the stratigraphy, as Emmet is pointing out, there's very little evidence of Islam then until about the 10th, 11th century. Heinsohn looks at it different because he's using some different coins to corroborate what he would say would be contemporary with Christianity. Looking at Jan Buford's work and what he's been writing, from what I've read so far, and it's only been several days, he just sent me something about Islam. I have to translate it. If you're going to look at it from Heinsohn's point of view, then the way we look at Christianity becomes completely illuminated a different way once the realignment happens. I don't know how Islam fits into that. It's much more, I'm going to call it, seems to be a violent period of time during the era of Jesus. And the scriptures then maybe glossing over what was actually happening. I'll just leave it at that, because I started reading this stuff and I'm just like, wow. Many, again, mainstreamers, they're stuck within the first 3 centuries of written sources, and they're arguing these written sources, and they're not looking at anything else. I don't know how that's going to end up. I don't know.
The whole history of this period is rapidly evolving.
Yeah.
And, arguments which were previously unthinkable and ideas which are now being thought openly, and things are changing rapidly. So light is gradually being shed on these very dark centuries.
Right.
I believe progress has been made.
Right. And we're dissidents here. For everybody watching and listening, I'm a dissident. Emmet's a dissident. Heinsohn, Illig, Velikovsky, they're dissidents. And I really enjoy having these interviews with Emmet. Again, started off with Gunnar Heinsohn, did a couple interviews, and not too long after that, he passed. That's very unfortunate. So again, I'm making contact with people, and I'm just trying to keep this thing going. It is controversial, but it should make us think. It should make us research a little bit more into what we think are facts, something that can be proven to be true. I think a lot of people have that thing about facts and their definition as it's very subjective, very subjective. Subjective truths to me aren't truths at all, or subjective facts aren't facts. We might think they are, but they really aren't. Emmet, again, I thank you for coming on, and for everybody. I'm going to end the stream, and we'll be back in several weeks. I have to do this at my own pace, essentially. I wish I could do things every day. Emmet is across the pond, as we like to call it. I can't do things late at night because of my schedule with him. So we have to kind of pick and choose our battles as we do them. So once again, Emmet, thanks for coming on, and hope this enlightened people. No golden age in Islam until much later, maybe the 13th or 14th century. So once again, thanks for coming on, Emmet. I'm going to end the stream. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks.
Thank you, Sean.
Yeah.